Yeah, there's a lot of talk out there about all sorts of things that the lame duck Congress could take up. I mean, cap and trade, amnesty for illegal aliens, the Bush tax cuts, all of this. How about the new START weapons treaty? A lot of people aren't paying attention to this, but I've talked to a lot of people who have been paying attention to this, and this is a bad deal from a lot of people that I've talked to. Matter of fact, they may want to call this, instead of the New START weapons treaty, the False START weapons treaty, and penalize the Russians 15 years. John Wohlstetter is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and we've had him on numerous times on the show. Welcome back, John. How are you?
Fine. How are you, Phil? Glad to be with you and your audience.
It's always our pleasure because you're very knowledgeable. Tell us what is wrong with this new START weapons treaty with Russia.
Well, lots of is wrong. First of all, it doesn't cover things like mobile missiles, which Russia is moving towards even more of, which is most modern weapons. Second of all, it does not. It actually is a reduction treaty only for us, since the Russians have fewer than 600 deployed warheads right now, 566. They will be able to add 134, so it isn't truly a mutual reduction treaty. The third thing is that it does not safeguard missile defense, because we are left with unilateral interpretations the Russians are free to reject. The way that, and the fourth one is that it has Swiss cheese verification, and by that I mean the holes are gaping, and that's worse than no verification at all, because it gives the illusion of security. We can only monitor 5 tests, because the Russians will be able to encrypt all their other missile tests with telemetry data. And we used to be able to monitor every single one of them. That's for nearly 20 years under the various START treaties. So this is a lower baseline of verification. The administration failed to insist on a verification commensurate with prior treaties, which it had leverage to do so.
So we've got several people who, and I understand Senator Bob Corker, who's from Tennessee, has indicated that he will not vote for this, and this has got to be ratified by the Senate, by the way, and not the House, because this is a treaty. But that Senator Corker is not going to vote for it in the lame duck session, but he is saying that he will vote for it when the full Senate meets back in January. Have you done some head counting on this and to see how many people are going to vote for this thing? Does it have a chance of passing?
Well, it's hard to do a head count, because in addition to the new Republicans coming in, you have independent Lisa Murkowski, and you have others that replaced other senators, and I haven't been able to do a head count. I think the real trap that the Republicans need to be careful for is that if they're allowed to attach reservations, which the Senate often does to treaties, to ratify treaties, say, okay, but with the following reservations, it isn't simply that those reservations are not binding on the Russians. They're not even binding on the administration. The administration, after all, can ignore the reservations in practice, just decline, for example, if the Russians object to a form of missile defense we propose to deploy at a future date. The administration can decline to ask for the necessary resources to deploy it. In addition to that, of course, the method of resolving disputes here is identical to the one 40 years ago with the strategic arms limitation agreements of the 70s, and that carried through the 80s. There is a bipartisan consultative commission, and that commission is us and the Russians. And the Russians basically can simply disagree, and there is no independent authority to referee that and resolve those disputes. Bilateral, it is bilateral consultative commission. This is the clone of the standing consultative commission of almost 40 years ago. Basically, you get in a room with the Russians, we say yes, they say niet. And there is no judge to come in and say, okay, you're right, you're wrong. No arbitrator.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. There were disputes that came up on whether or not we could deploy systems based on so-called different physical principles, a phrase that was in the ABM Treaty, the Missile Defense Treaty of 1972. lasers are quite different from rockets. Despite that, the Russians protested. Arms controllers in this country who opposed missile defense joined them, and we wound up having our research crimped then. And even more pointedly, the arms negotiator Eugene Rostow, who was a top international lawyer of his time, said in the 80s that unilateral reservations have, quote, the same legal effect as a letter from my mother, unquote. Basically, we could say anything we want in our understandings, and there were several disputes, and the Russians say, so what?
Right.
When they replaced their SS-11 missiles with a larger SS-19 missile and went from a single warhead to a MIRV missile that was vastly more lethal, we said this is not a replacement within the definitions of the treaty, which are too technical to repeat, in a quick radio show. And they said, yes, it is. And they replaced it.
And my understanding is we have reduced, and you tell me if this is right or not, we have reduced our nuclear missile supply to about 10% of what it was at its peak. Is that right?
Well, yeah, we have, at its peak, we had, and these are figures the administration finally released in April, to its credit, we had in 1967 32,000 warheads.
And now we got about 3.
Well, we had, to put it in a little more perspective, there were 12,000 at the time of start that were deployed, and we never had anything like 30,000 deployed. And then we reduced those down. We've reduced 70% from the peak. We have under 10,000 in total, and we have only 2,200 deployed, and we're headed towards 1,550 in sublimits. And the thing is that we've been setting an example, which is one of the things they talk about, and the Russians have come down from an even higher peak of 45,000. And the North Koreans and the Iranians are not impressed. So this is we've already had very steep reductions. There's no need for another steep reduction at this time. It's far more important to secure loose nuclear material,
right,
because the warheads on American and Russian missiles are almost impossible to set off. They're not impossible, but it's very hard because they have all sorts of safety locks and triggers. And it's not as if you get 100 million tries with a computer to try and break the codes on these things. After a very limited number of tries,
it shuts down.
That's right. It says, listen, you get only 3 tries to get into your password in somebody's internet account.
Right.
So it's difficult to do. It's not easy to move those things around, to set them off. And as a result of that, we should be focusing far more on the threat from rogue states transferring the weapons to terrorists. It's not the terrorist groups themselves, because they can't make this stuff.
It's third parties selling it to them, like former Soviet Union scientists and things like that. Well, I just want to ask you: we don't see as big a threat from Russia now as we did from the Soviet Union, or do we, because of these weapons that are out there that somebody is going to sell on the black market? Well,
we believe that we're within a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, of fully securing the weapons that are out there. The time of far greater danger was in the 90s, when the Bush Senior and 2 Clinton administrations acted very decisively to secure a lot of the material. The work was continued in Bush 2 and Bush 43, and President Obama, to his credit, has continued this work too. So it's not zero, but I'm more worried about a rogue state deliberately transferring, which could be sale or gift, to a terrorist group, a nuclear weapon. There's also the theft possibility you have is still not a purely stateless thing, in the sense that any group with the resources to do this is going to have gotten some state assistance in how it organizes the stuff and sets up. But in addition, the state is culpably negligent in failing to safeguard that material. And of course, sale or gift, the state is a sponsor of the act. So 2 of the 3 ways you can transfer: the state that created the nuclear material, the weapons grade, which cannot be done in your backyard, it's an industrial process, will be a partner in the transaction, and in that case, they're simply using a group that is supposedly stateless as a delivery vehicle.
So we should not be signing any kind of a treaty with Russia, or just not this one?
No, we should negotiate a better treaty with Russia. It probably can't happen in this administration because having given in on this one, they're not likely to drive a harder bargain, and Moscow would probably walk away. But if we get a new administration and a Republican Senate, instead of relying on unilateral reservations and ratifying, which they will ignore, you negotiate a treaty that covers mobile missiles, that covers submarine-launched nuclear missiles, that has verification at least as good as the verification in the last 20 years' worth of treaties, and that in general, and of course preserves in full explicitly, not by implication, the right to missile defense, so that there's no argument over that, and without having a veto from Moscow. So that's the kind of deal this administration, frankly, won't ask for, and the Democratic Senate won't insist on it. It should be then in a new administration, and where you have used the leverage that Russia is economically in much worse shape even than we are. They cannot afford another arms race, and therefore they have an incentive to negotiate a deal, even if it's not as attractive to them as this one.
Well, people can read more about this, I guess, at letterfromthecapital.com. Is that right, John?
Letterfromthecapital.com. Letter from the Capitol is my one-stop shop. I had an article in Verification posted in Human Events. People can go there, and they can check my articles from time to time. And I had some posts earlier this week on the issues that we've been discussing.
Excellent. John Wohlstetter. Please, appreciate it very much, John. Lots of information, and people can learn more by going to the website letterfromthecapital.com.
And they can buy my book there, too, if they wish. Thank you very much, and thank your audience for tuning in.
Thanks, John.